Hi, I'm Ashley Nardone, and I'm part of the Strip District campus. And I'm here with Kurt today. We're going to talk a little bit about politics this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm great.
Me too. Fall's finally here a little bit.
It is.
Yeah.
I actually just filled out my mail-in ballot the other day.
Yeah.
Sent it in already.
Nice.
So I actually have done my voting.
Look at that. I'm a little bit behind the curve. I need to get on
Yeah.
it, but that's great.
Yeah, I kind of like the whole, I don't have to wait in line.
Right.
Just fill it out, send
Right.
it in,
Yeah.
and boom.
We go as a family, and we get our little stickers together, and then we treat ourselves with ice cream
Oh,
afterwards.
that's a good move. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you got the kids that are still that age.
Right.
I had the thing where, because I've got some adult children, their mail-in ballots came. So we've all converted to full mail-in.
Yeah.
So they were all like lined
Lined
up
up.
here. But I'm the kind of person, I don't like to handle my paper too many times because then it gets in a stack. So I'm just
Right.
like, today,
Do
I'm
it.
doing it, it's done.
Good.
So yeah,
That's
that's
nice.
what I did.
So I was just kind of thinking about, everything in this election season. Do we identify primarily as Americans who practice Christianity or Christians who live in America?
As Americans who practice Christianity or Christians who live in America, obviously I would go Christians who live in America, simply because I think that should be your primary identity,
Right.
rather than Americans first. Yeah, so that would probably be the way I'd answer that.
And how do either of these identities influence our perspectives on politics?
Yeah, I think if you start with I'm an American who happens to be a Christian, I mean, in a way, it's probably splitting hairs, because I can see where, well, you are an American by default who
Right.
happens to be a Christian.
Right.
Therefore, your Christianity should impact your thinking as a citizen. And if you say, oh, I'm a Christian who happens to live in America, in a way, I think either way, your faith should have some impact on your way of thinking, because if it doesn't, then your faith hasn't impacted you. And so there's really, to me, there's not a separation, and trying to, and I'm not saying you are, but trying
Right.
to make too fine a point of, oh, I'm this or that. It should just be an organic thing where, of course, if you read your Bible, if you think biblically about things, that should impact your views, which should impact your politics.
Right.
What to me is not as clear as some people like it to be is, therefore, this is the conclusion every person of faith should come to about every issue.
Right.
And we can talk more about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's what's not as clear in
Right.
my mind as I think it is to a lot of people,
Right.
who just simply say, well, there's this issue, therefore everybody ought to have this view, period. Yeah.
So just thinking about our country and our founding fathers, do you think that they intended America to be a Christian nation?
So I know that's actually a debate some people have. As far as I understand it, the founding fathers were more deistic in their faith than they were, what you'd consider to be current Christian, meaning, yeah, we have a nod to God. Clearly they wanted biblical principles to be involved in the thinking of the nation, meaning value of human life, the dignity of each individual, opportunity, some of those things that are part of our founding documents clearly were informed by some of their worldview, which was somewhat Christian.
Right.
Christian nation, I think they wanted freedom of religion, which would not be Christian in the truest sense of the word,
Right.
because then you would say, well, everybody should be a Christian rather than freedom of religion. But even I would say that's born out of a Christian worldview, because in a Christian worldview, you don't feel like you should compel everybody to the same behavior or the same belief. You believe that it stands as an idea that people can respond to or not respond to. And so I think that was more my understanding of where they were. But yeah, that's a good question.
That's great. Yeah, my daughter actually, we were picking her up from school, and she said, Mom, I'm not really supposed to talk about God in school, but I say God in my Pledge Allegiance and other things. Like, why is that there? And so I was struggling to answer that for her. And I think just knowing the personalities of the founding fathers and doing a little research there was helpful. And I'll have to pass that along to her now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know I've had some conversations, and there are some people who are just not really happy with either candidate, and they also think that a write-in vote would be in vain. What are some ways that we could help, kind of have conversations and walk people through that, through some of that are having those feelings?
Yeah. I don't love either candidate. And so I get that.
Yeah.
And there's a piece of me that says, is this the best America can do?
Right.
But also, I understand the argument of the lesser of two evils, if you want to use that, meaning, hey, I don't want to write in, because generally it's a two-person race for president, at least. There are other elections that matter as well. Therefore, I'm going to choose whoever I think is less egregious. I think that's a legitimate way to think about it. I know there's other people who feel like, oh no, it's all about just the views, who cares about anything else? And I've thought this for a while. I actually have a couple scriptures here that I'll give you, you can look up, but there's I think at least three things that should be considered when you're thinking about voting. One is the person capable? Meaning they have requisite skills that you say, for the level of job, could they do this?
Right.
And I think we've become increasingly less demanding of our presidential candidates in terms of experience, skills, some of those things. We elected a reality TV star a few years ago who was a business owner, ran a big business, but, okay, can they do this? And Proverbs 8:15, 16, Proverbs 15:22, really clear about the idea that people should have skills. Then I think we ask is this person ethical? And I think a lot of people skip this. But again, Proverbs 16, 12, 13, Proverbs 29, 4 speak to that. And then I think you ask does this person have views that are compatible with my views? And are my views compatible with the biblical worldview on those issues? And again, Proverbs 8:14 probably speaks to that. And as I think about that, I think there's probably a handful of issues that you could say, okay, how do these issues speak biblically? Just quick list, and I did write this down. So, judge appointments certainly matter in terms of how the nation lives. Isaiah 126. I think a lot of people would talk about border immigration, which, by the way, can really cut both ways biblically, because, there's the idea of the secure border people will talk about, and there's a way to do that, but having a heart for immigrants is clearly a biblical ideal. So simply saying we're shutting down border, expelling everybody, I'm not sure you're on the biblical side when you go down that path. But I'm also not sure that simply having it up and not having any structure is a good idea. Israel, for some people, becomes a real issue. Genesis 12:3, the whole idea, if you bless me, bless Israel. Really interesting idea biblically, because I'm not sure that the biblical nation of Israel that today is who that was intended for. Although there's a lot of Christians who say, whoever's for Israel the most staunchly is the biblical candidate. Again, more nuance there. Religious liberty, I would say, is an issue that should be thought about. Exodus 23. Certainly the way that candidates handle gender, transgenderism is an issue, I think, at least to think about. Abortion is obviously an issue. The economy is an issue that I think is still biblical. The Bible speaks a lot about money, so who has a good view on taxation in the economy that's going to help the nation thrive? I think war is something we underestimate also in Christian circles. If somebody is more likely to lead the nation into war, that is an ugly reality that I don't think we want to under consider as we consider an issue. And so those are all issues that I would say need to be thought about and are part of trying to say what is a biblical public posture on these, if there is one, and then how do the candidates relate to those issues.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that kind of leads into my next question a little bit about political parties, right? They tend, especially now, very polarized here and there. So are we called to call out our political parties when we don't agree with everything?
Yes. I think it's, I think if you take a biblical view, you will end up at odds at some point with your political party, no matter which party it is.
Right.
And I realize that there's a lot of people who won't agree with me on that, who will say, oh no,
Yeah.
my party is the biblical party.
Right.
But there are too many things that end up like, and so that does raise the question, which issues are most important? Is there a single issue that should, concern you, like where it's so bad? And my answer would be, well, there could be. For example, and as far as I know, no candidate has said this, but if a candidate said, you know what, for the sake of the economy, the sake of all kinds of things, we're just going to start killing everyone who's 70 because statistically they're all going to die in 8 years anyway.
Right.
And they're just going to be a drain on our economy. So 70-year-old, we just knock them off.
Yeah.
I would say, as a person of faith, that would become a single issue that I would say, you know what, I don't feel good killing everyone who's 70.
Yeah.
Not to mention it would take my mom and a few other people out who I'd be like, I don't love that. And I'm getting closer to it than I ever was.
Maybe you're a little closer.
That's right. I mean, when I was 30, I might have been like, but so yes, there can be a single issue that's so egregious that you say, this isn't just a scorecard of here's 8 issues, 10 issues, 20 issues, because you can have an issue where you say that is so unbiblical that I can't vote for that candidate. What becomes hard is, and this goes back to what you said earlier about the two kind of lesser of two evils, or how do you do that, and if the write-in isn't there, is sometimes you might even feel like I have single issues on both sides that make me not want to vote for those people.
Right.
And that becomes really hard at that point, because then all of a sudden it's, okay, now I'm trying to decide between two things that feel to me to be almost egregious to that level.
Right.
If that's where you end up.
Yeah.
So somebody sent me an article recently, and this maybe goes to a little bit of this question too, and it was, the article was, why are Christians carrying water for the left? And this article, it was in the Federalist, but I thought it was interesting. It said this: professing evangelical David French made heads spin recently when his New York Times opinion article, if you're not familiar, David French writes for the New York Times, is a lawyer, Christian guy, claimed that the way we save conservatism is to elect Kamala Harris, the most radical pro-abortion candidate for the U.S. president in U.S. history. French is not alone. A stream of faith leaders who've lined up behind leftist issues such as climate change, ongoing vaccinations, and immigration, giving them the weight of gospel imperatives good Christians should support. What gives? Asked the rank-and-file church member in a pew. How are we to come to a place where Christians are too intimidated to talk about topics where Christianity has much to say, such as sexuality and the sexes, and instead push the same narrative that's heard on any major network? To put it simply, why are Christians carrying water for the left? And I thought it was an interesting premise because I'm old enough to have watched some things develop over years, and even in 2000, when really 92, when Al Gore first ran as a Democrat for the presidential nomination, then he became Bill Clinton's running mate, vice president for 8 years, then ran again in 2000. Al Gore was a pro-life Democrat, which in the day and age that we're in today, a pro-life Democrat is an oxymoron.
Where are you?
And it's almost impossible to find. So it's interesting to watch the way things have changed, that has become such a defining issue of the two parties. And I think the point of this article is there's a lot of Christian leaders now who are saying, hey, we shouldn't be single issue on that issue or any issue. And if you look at all the issues, we even lean left in terms of that. And I think the reason that's interesting is because a lot of people would say, well, the issues that have more substance tend to lean right in terms of a biblical perspective. And I can understand that, and I can understand the thinking of that. And what I would like to see is actual debate on the issues, rather than just kind of a blanket. Well, let's go this way.
Right.
Like let's get in and talk about like abortion as an issue. If you haven't heard me or don't know me at all or my story, I was born to an unwed mom, and right before Roe versus Wade became the law of the land. And so when I met my birth mother, one of the things she said to me is, yeah, if abortion had been legal, I would have aborted you. Which, so for me, it kind of took it out of this ethereal conversation to, oh my goodness. But even that issue is worth a lot of conversation because, as people have rightly pointed out in recent days, if you're going to be consistently pro-life, then IVF is a challenge you need to think about. What do you do in issues of rape and incest?
Right.
What,
the layers.
Yeah, what do you do if there's and so what I would love to see is people actually engaging in substantive conversation about the issues rather than soundbite attack. Because I think even on something like abortion, it would be healthy for Christians and non-Christians to get into conversations about what constitutes life.
Yeah.
Why are you, saying this is life? Because there's challenges all the way through. And same thing when you go to, a more democratic position that says we can abort up to the, birth of the child. But yet in the same hospital, you'll fight to save the life of a child who's born at 28 weeks, 26 weeks. And so clearly that child's viable. And then to just say we're going to leave that child to die on the table if the abortion doesn't work exactly. I mean, so let's have those conversations rather than not. And I think it would be good in the public sphere. And the day we're recording this is the day after the J.D. Vance, Tim Walz debate last night. I don't know if you watched any of it.
I caught the end of it, yeah.
And I'm enough of a political nerd that I kind of like watching some of it. I didn't watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
But what I liked about it is it felt like a debate between ideas rather than personal attacks.
Agreed.
And I thought that was so good to see because it feels like we've just degenerated into who can have a soundbite and attack.
Yeah.
Rather than, we're talking about these issues and here's where I stand, here's where you stand.
Right.
America, you decide.
Yeah. I thought it was really refreshing being the last time probably on a national level that we would hear from either party before we go into voting. And I really did also appreciate the debate between the two VPs there.
Yeah.
I think that also brings me to another point. There's a pastor I follow. He's a church up in New York, I believe.
Okay.
And before every election, he quotes, I don't want to misquote him, but he says, his role as a pastor is not to make everyone agree, but that when we have these disagreements, to make sure that it doesn't lead to disunity. And I think I was kind of thinking about that when you're talking about these single issues and left and right, and even within the church, we can have some of those disagreements. How would you help all of your members, help all of us, all Christians, just kind of stay in that path? Like we can disagree and it not lead to disunity.
Yeah. So I think our nation and our Christian churches have changed some in recent years in that it has become more polarized. And I think what you're going to see in the years ahead, and I'm not sure this is a good thing, but I think it's what you're going to see, is that more and more people will identify with a church based on their stances rather than saying, I want to be in a church where we disagree. I actually think it's healthier to be in a church where there's disagreement. It's more uncomfortable, but I think it's better. Now, are there things Christians should agree on? Yes. So I'm not saying everything's up. There are some things that it's like, no, this is what the Bible says. But a lot of these issues, again, take immigration. It is really healthy to sit in a small group with somebody who doesn't necessarily see everything the same way and to have a conversation. And if you're not having those conversations in the church, where can you have them? So I think it's healthy, but what I think you're going to see is churches will emerge that are very clearly Republican. They won't say that, but it's like, this is the biblical way. You've got to believe this on all these issues. And if you cast a vote on the opposite side, you're somehow complicit with evil.
Right.
And then you have people who are more progressive, Democratic who will say, hey, these are the issues of compassion, and if you're not here, you're kind of evil too because you aren't over here.
Yeah.
And I think some people will gravitate to that.
Yeah.
Because they'll say, this is what I like, and I've said this before, and here we are doing a podcast, but in this era of increasing podcasts, you can find a niche belief system that fits you so well that you're not forced to deal with other views. And then I think you'll have churches, which I hope Orchard Hill is one, where it's a little broader, not because we don't believe that there's answers to the questions, but we believe there's some room for some people to come to some different answers on some of the questions. Again, some of them I think do have an answer that's like, that's probably the biblical answer. But I think that's healthy and respectful. And what I've tried to do also is say, at least for me, and again, I follow politics enough that it's not like I'm not aware of what's going on, but I almost feel like we need not a break from it to come on Sunday, but if we're going to teach the word, we're going to teach when the text says something that is about a political issue. We're not going to shy away. But I don't want to go to church and hear a take on a Bible verse with a Fox News or an MSNBC take.
Right.
I want to hear the text taught. And if it happens to go to a political issue, don't shy away. Teach me the text. But I want to come and hear the word of God, not somebody's proof texting of a political position.
Right.
So that's what we try to do here, and I hope that leads to a health in terms of spiritual life, spiritual growth, spiritual development, rather than politics. And again, I say, and there's balance because you do need to speak to issues. Like I don't want a kid to grow up going to Orchard Hill and then to leave Orchard Hill after they've grown up here all their years and say, I've never heard the Bible taught on subject X, Y, or Z.
Right.
That's not good either. And so I think you can get so far to the, hey, we're not political, that you never say, does the Bible speak to the issues of our day? And I think it does.
Yes.
But you can also be so political that when somebody walks through your doors, they go, oh, you're Republican with a Bible verse, you're Democrat with a Bible verse, rather than you're trying to teach the Bible and where it applies, it does. So that's what we've tried to do as a church.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's been what has happened.
That's great. I think you're spot on, and I think it takes me to another point, just thinking about, and this is none of my neighbors, so let me just preference that. But, I mean, we can go around, there are signs and flags, and it's everywhere, and people are just being obnoxious. And so, how do we deal with that? How do you deal with the obnoxious neighbor, the obnoxious friend, that just is totally overboard? What would you say there?
Obviously just kindness. I mean, there's no, you're not probably going to talk anybody out of a position on social media or in a quick conversation over a sidewalk in your neighborhood. So to me, it's kindness and kind of walking down that path. Yeah,
I think that's great. I think that as simple as that is, I think I've witnessed, even with fellow Christians, that is so easily forgotten. That's step one is grace and humility, and spot on. Just
even giving the benefit of the doubt, even to candidates that you really dislike, because it's been such a season of demonizing, and both ways, and not just at the presidential level either. That I think it's important to really be able to say, some people have a different view, a different pathway, but to assign sinister motives to everybody on the other side. And I realize that probably moves the needle more in terms of elections, because it's easier to say, I've got to mobilize a base, and the best way to do that is to make this other person evil.
Right.
And to fearmonger and tell you every horrible thing that will happen if they're elected. But there's something gregarious, and again, back to last night's debate, which wasn't last night probably when you're listening to this, but the debate between Vance and Walz, there was that civility again, where you saw them say, okay, I'm not going to assume that you're this evil operative.
Right.
I disagree with you. Here's all the places I disagree. But I think there's something good in that if you can say, you know what? I remember I had breakfast with an older guy who had been at the church years ago, and it was on the morning after a presidential election that went a way that many Christians were like, oh my goodness, the world's going to collapse and all of this. And I remember he just said to me, he said, it'll be fine. He said, once everyone realizes that, this person is just got different views.
Yeah.
It'll be like, okay, it is what it is. That's what won the election. And but it plays better, and clickbait plays better on presidential things, everything to be fear-mongering. Like this podcast would get more clicks if we were like, here's the way that you must vote, or everything's going to go wrong in the nation, than if we take any kind of like, let's try to understand and give some grace and have good conversations. Like that doesn't sell.
No.
And I get that, but I think it's a better approach. And I've joked with people before on, sometimes I'll listen to sports talk, which that's one of my vices in life. But when I listen to sports talk, it's not interesting to say, Russell Wilson has some pros, Justin Field has some pros, and they're both kind of good options.
Right.
It's much better to be like, Justin Fields, get him down.
Yeah.
Russell Wilson stinks. We need. I mean, that's what you listen for, because it's a lot more fun than any kind of. But the problem is we've adopted that into substantive conversations rather than saying, let's have real conversations about substance.
Because these conversations are harder, right?
That's right.
It's much harder for us to sit here and think about the nuances and the layers of things, and it's much easier for us to use fear-mongering. And you said that, and it made me think about, again, my own kids, and we were watching things on TV, and here come the ads, and now before bedtime they're like, well, what is this really happening? And they have, they are very impressionable at that age, and so they're afraid, and they're afraid for our nation. And so what are some ways that we can kind of help children and younger people understand politics and what's happening, and how those ads and those tactics are used?
That's a great question. So my kids are a little older. Your kids are grade school age and younger.
Yeah.
Mine are out of grade school. And so when I look back at raising our kids in an environment that maybe wasn't as charged, but it wasn't not charged.
Yeah.
We tried to have honest conversations every time something came up about any issue. And so what we tried to do was just say, oh yeah, here's what you just saw. What do you think about it? Let's talk about it. And then tried to bring some kind of biblical thinking to the moment. And I tend to think that's the best way to proceed with kids. And the biggest downside of that is then sometimes they'll want to go to school and talk about it.
Yeah.
But I think that negative outweighs, or is outweighed by the positive of having good conversations. Because if you don't, what happens is, like, if you're like, I don't want my kid to have to talk about this yet, then what happens is it doesn't get talked about, then they talk about it at school or somewhere else, and all of a sudden they're getting their worldview formed from somewhere else.
Right.
So our take was always, as soon as it's a natural conversation, we're going to have the conversation. And so I would use it if I were parenting young kids today. I would try to say, all right, we saw this, we're going to talk about it, and try to do it in real time, where you're not having big talks, you're having 100 little talks as the issues come up. And the thing that I think it requires is you to be attentive enough to say, oh, this is a moment, and then to have the energy to step into it. Because a lot of times it's easier when you're a parent of young kids just to be like, I don't want to do that today. I just want to get them to bed so I can have a little me time. And so just to say, I'm going to step into that for a few moments, because kids, and you know this, they are, by the time they're 5, 6, 7, they start asking great questions, and they are thinking and forming views that way outpace where you want to think they are. And so, and again, if you're in the middle of it, you know it, but you forget it sometimes when you're not there. But as I look back, I mean, our kids were forming such big views at such young ages that that's the thing I would say to parents go in, have the conversations, explain the issues, obviously age appropriate, but even something like abortion is not, I wouldn't shy away from that conversation because they're going to hear the word, they're going to form a view quickly. I would rather be out front of that than behind it.
That's great. I kind of feel like I have the cheat code a little bit with you here. So just talking about that, is there any character in the Old Testament that you would give an example that lived through some of these times of tension like we're seeing now, that we could have an example of that to kind of share?
So I should have read your questions ahead of time because then I would have thought about this. I haven't thought about this. And partly because we want it to be an organic conversation instead of feeling over-scripted. So a character in the Old Testament who lived through harsh political times that would help us think about. I mean, obviously you have Joseph early in the Old Testament. Certainly you have, the places where the prophets lived and the kings kind of pushed on some of those things. So, I'm not a huge fan of trying to read the Old Testament as a model as much as a pointer to Jesus. And I don't mean that there's not things to take, but I think what happens sometimes with our Old Testament reading is we read it almost like one of Aesop's fables, where it's like, oh, here's a character and look at all the things they did right. Or here's a character and look at all the things they did wrong.
Yeah.
So do this or don't do this. And what we end up doing is we end up reading kind of this like oh, this is the good things. Do this. Certainly you could talk about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, oh, these guys lived in the culture and look at how they stood up. And I don't think that's an illegitimate use of Scripture, but I don't think that's the ultimate use of Scripture. I think it's we have the story of Daniel to show us how God preserved a people through such things. And the lesson isn't be like Daniel, although that's a side, not bad thing to say. But like that old song, Dare to be a Daniel. It's like, well, okay, yeah, but the point is God preserved a people in spite of faithfulness or lack of faithfulness of the people.
Yeah.
And that's what gives us confidence. And so even using an Old Testament lesson, I would say it's to say God's going to work in this nation regardless of who's elected, regardless of what happens. We may not like the outcome. In fact, if you read your Old Testament, I would say one of the things that is often hardest to reconcile is that God used seemingly evil people and empires to chasten his people toward repentance.
Yeah.
So if you really want to apply that to America today, what you would probably have to say is there's going to be some rough days ahead.
Yeah.
Because God is going to bring his version of the Assyrians to our door. That's not a really comforting message that anybody really wants to apply. But if you're really going to say, okay, hey, what he did then is what he does now. And again, I'm not sure that's the best way to read it because it's not a surefire prediction of everything that will happen. But it says God's not opposed to doing this. His character is not out of line with saying, I would rather have people drawn to me through hardship than preserve them from all hardship.
Yeah.
But I'm going to preserve a group of people that will be faithful to me regardless of what's going on around me.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So do you think that as Christians we have a moral obligation to participate in elections and politics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should vote at a minimum.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what it's at a minimum.
Yeah, I think voting.
And in other ways?
I think people will have different levels of feeling engaged, meaning some people should run for office, some people should campaign for people or speak on behalf of issues they believe in without a doubt. But I think at a minimum voting obligation, I mean, there's not a biblical verse that I'd point to and say, oh, you ought to vote. So I'm an implicational way when I say you ought to, meaning if somebody's like, no, I'm a conscientious objector, I wouldn't say, oh, you're sinning.
Right.
But it seems to me that to not let your voice be heard through the voting process is an abdication. Now, having said that, you asked earlier about a write-in. I think there's probably a time for a write-in candidate to say, I'm so objected to either side that I'm going to register my protest through a write-in or something like that. I do think that's legitimate.
Well, Kurt, thanks so much for this conversation. It's been great.
Great. Thanks, Ashley, and great to be with you today. As always, there's a lot of great content on Orchard Hill Plus. There's 5 Good Minutes. There's this Perspectives podcast. There's the Good Book thing. There's some of the classes that are there. Campuses all over Pittsburgh, a region that you can be a part of. So have a great day, and thanks for making this part of your day.